The date was April 10th, 1941. Deep within the scorched heart of North Africa, a force of 14,000 Australians found themselves staring into the abyss. They were encircled by a combined juggernaut of 35,000 Axis soldiers, including the elite divisions of Rommel's Africa Corps. Behind them lay a crumbling fortress. Before them, a sea of steel, tanks, and the relentless wings of the Luftwaffe. The world watched with bated breath, for the mission seemed like a suicide pact. Stay and hold until the end. Most experts gave them no hope, yet for 241 days, these men transformed a dusty perimeter into a wall of fire. They didn't just survive, they redefined the very nature of defiance. In the complex geometry of the Second World War, the port of Tobruk was the most coveted square on the board. This wasn't merely a desolate coastal settlement in Libya, it was the crown jewel of logistics, the only harbor with deep waters located between the cities of Alexandria and Benghazi. Control of this port meant control over the lifeblood of the entire North African theater. For the German High Command, Tobruk was the golden key to the Suez Canal and the vast energy reserves of the East. For the Allies, it was the final dam preventing the Axis tide from flooding Cairo. General Erwin Rommel, the legendary _quote_0_, had previously moved across the dunes with the speed of a predator, leaving only wreckage in his wake. He was a man whose name was synonymous with lightning warfare, a commander who seemed beyond the reach of defeat. However, the fox had finally hit a snare. His supply columns were dangerously overextended, stretching 1,000 miles back to the docks of Tripoli. Every crate of ammunition and every liter of fuel had to endure a grueling journey across the wastes. If Rommel could seize Tobruk, the war would tilt in his favor instantly. Without it, he was bleeding resources he couldn't replace. Into this furnace stepped the Australian 9th Division under Lieutenant General Leslie Morshead. Their orders were chillingly simple: defend the harbor at any price. On April 11th, 1941, the silence of the desert was shattered by a mechanical roar. The German assault began with the cold elegance of a predator. Panzer tanks clawed through the dunes, their armor glinting in the harsh light. From above, Stuka dive bombers plummeted like shrieking hawks, their sirens designed to paralyze the soul with fear. The initial defenses, scavenged from old Italian works, seemed like toys against such a modern industrial onslaught. Bunkers were ground into dust, and trenches were buried under a rain of high explosives. But the Australians possessed a secret weapon that Rommel hadn't accounted for. They realized that a fortress is more than just stone and wire. It is the ground itself. They vanished into a hidden world of limestone galleries, interconnected tunnels, and jagged caves. While the German artillery hammered the surface into a lunar landscape, the defenders waited in the cool dark like ghosts. When the smoke cleared and the Axis infantry moved in to claim their prize, they were met by a sudden, lethal storm of fire from men who refused to stay dead. On the dark night of April 13th, a German breach threatened to collapse the entire line. It was then that Corporal John Edmondson and a small band of brothers decided to gamble with fate. Under a hail of lead, they fixed their bayonets and charged into the teeth of the German positions. Though mortally wounded, Edmondson's ferocity broke the enemy's will and saved the perimeter. His Victoria Cross was a testament to a new reality. The Germans had finally met an enemy that wouldn't flinch. The siege soon became a grueling marathon of attrition, where every dawn was a gamble with death. The infamous 88mm guns of the Germans, originally meant to clear the skies, were now leveled at the Australian foxholes. These weren't just attacks. They were calculated attempts to erase the garrison from the map. The environment itself was a hostile combatant. Temperatures frequently breached 120 degrees Fahrenheit, turning the bunkers into ovens. Each man was limited to a single half-gallon of water daily, a precious liquid that had to serve for hydration, hygiene, and survival. Yet the heat was a minor nuisance compared to the flies. They were an unstoppable plague, a black cloud that covered every wound and every morsel of food. Disease, specifically dysentery, became a constant shadow. In the subterranean hospitals, surgeons worked by the flickering light of candles, performing grigial surgeries as the earth shook above them. One medic's diary captured the grim spirit of the place. Quote, "Zero." German radio began to refer to them as, quote, "one," a term meant to degrade them, but the Australians wore it like a crown. They decided that if they were rats, they would be the kind that bite. Under the leadership of Lieutenant Colonel Ralph Honor, they pioneered a terrifying brand of night warfare. In the dead of night, small squads would slip through the wire, moving through the desert like shadows to strike German outposts with surgical cruelty. These weren't desperate acts of a cornered animal, but the refined tactics of a superior predator. Many of these men were former bushmen and hunters, and they turned the dunes into a graveyard for German officers. The psychological toll on the Axis forces was immense. To the Germans, the Australians seemed possessed by a strange, dark humor. They would broadcast jazz and folk songs into the night, their laughter carrying across the sand even after the heaviest bombardments. One German letter captured the growing unease. "These Australians are not human. They sing while we kill them. They laugh at our strength. How do you fight people who do not know fear?" But the survival of the fortress also depended on a lifeline stretched across 300 miles of treacherous water. While the land battle burned, a secondary war was fought in the deep blue of the Mediterranean. The Royal Australian Navy took on the impossible task of keeping the garrison alive. This became the Rat Run, a high-stakes sprint from Alexandria into the mouth of the enemy's guns. The seas were thick with German U-boats, and the sky was owned by the Luftwaffe. The destroyers made this journey 139 times, logging 50,000 miles of combat travel, the equivalent of 2 full trips around the planet. These ships were like phantoms, arriving under the cloak of midnight and departing before the sun could expose them to the bombers. The HMAS Waterhen became a symbol of this bravery until May 29th, when the sky finally fell on her. For 36 hours, her crew fought a losing battle against fire and water, eventually sinking just 15 miles from the safety of the coast. But she died with her mission complete. Every ton of supplies she delivered was a heartbeat for the men in the trenches. Every successful run meant more bullets, more bread, and more hope for a world that was starving for a victory. As the months dragged on, the Desert Fox found his legendary status evaporating. The man who had humiliated France was now being held at bay by a group of irregulars who simply ignored his brilliance. For the first time, Erwin Rommel was a commander who couldn't deliver, and the entire world was taking notes. He doubled his efforts, turning Tobruk into a cauldron of fire with non-stop shelling and aerial strikes. Night and day, the ground trembled under the weight of German explosives. But a curious transformation was taking place. It wasn't the Australians who were breaking. It was the morale of the besiegers. The German soldiers, who had been promised a quick march to victory, found themselves trapped in a nightmare of endless siege and hidden snipers. Doubt began to seep into their ranks. The image of the invincible Nazi soldier was shattering like glass. Rommel himself would eventually write in his private records, "The Australians fought with a tenacity I have seldom seen equaled." Coming from a conqueror, this was the ultimate admission of defeat. He had been outplayed in his own backyard. Through the blistering summer of 1941, the garrison stood firm. By August, after 4.5 months of relentless combat, the Australian government called their exhausted heroes home. The Rats had done more than hold a port. They had broken the momentum of the Axis. As the relief forces arrived in the darkness, the departing Australians left behind a legacy of iron. The British 70th Division and the Polish Carpathian Brigade took up the mantle, standing in the same limestone trenches forged by Australian grit. The siege would endure for another 3.5 months, but the moral victory had already been won. Tobruk was no longer a target. It was a symbol of the impossible. In November 1941, the siege was finally lifted during Operation Crusader. A pincer movement from the east and a breakout from within finally cleared the horizon. After 242 days, the ordeal was over. But those first 120 days, when the Australians stood alone against the full might of the fox, were the days that tilted the axis of the war. In the aftermath, as the numbers were tallied, the strategic significance became clear. This wasn't just a tactical win. It was the day the world realized the German army could be bled dry. Winston Churchill recognized this as a definitive turning point. The Australians had achieved what no other military force had yet done. They had forced Rommel into a stalemate and held it for 8 long months. Perhaps the most enduring praise came from the enemy commander himself, who noted in his memoirs that he had never encountered a more difficult adversary in any theater of war. The name _0_ was no longer a slur. It was a title of nobility. These were the common men, the clerks, the smiths, the farmers, who had transformed themselves into legends through pure, unadulterated willpower. Today, the name Tobruk is etched into the geography of Australia. From the Pacific coast to the Indian Ocean, monuments stand to honor those who chose to stand when every reason suggested they should fall. They didn't seek the spotlight or the medals. The rats only wanted to finish the task at hand. That task was simple. Do not let the line break. Hold it when the steel rain falls. Hold it when the sky screams. Hold it when the thirst burns and the flies bite. They held it because they knew that if the line failed there, it might fail everywhere. For 241 days, they were the anchors of the free world. They fought with old rifles and raw courage, with wire and sand, and with a defiant laugh that could be heard over the roar of the cannons. They stood until the shadows retreated. They stood until the myth of invincibility was buried in the Libyan sand. The rats of Tobruk reminded humanity of a forgotten truth in the dark hours of 1941, that when ordinary people find their backs against the wall, they are capable of achieving the divine. When you face your own impossible odds, remember those 14,000 men who looked at an empire and dared it to try. They didn't just survive. They stood their ground until the rest of the world found its voice again. If you believe their story matters, tell it. Because such heroes belong to everyone who has ever had to stand up when the world told them to kneel. The rats came out of the dark. They fought like demons, and then they became immortal.